Okay, guys. So you should have a packet that says 1965 SREE packet. As we're going through all of this, I want you guys to highlight or underline anything that you find interesting so that afterwards we can talk about it. So, this is going to give us a little bit more background into the time period that The Outsiders takes place in, because believe it or not, the book actually doesn't do very much into the background. So, The Outsiders takes place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1965. This top shot is a picture from the movie. Um, so the like I said, it takes place in 1965, and the 60s had a ton of history going on. It was really hard to just fit what I thought was important into this presentation. This, even though it doesn't show up in the book, it probably was very influential to S.E. Hinton, who was only a teenager when she wrote this book. So imagine you guys writing a book right now. What significant events would you feel like kind of have shaped your life? Maybe like living through COVID and masks and schools shutting down. I know there were a lot of protests in 2020. So there's been a lot of big things on the news that would probably influence you if you were going to write a book right now. All right. So some big things that were going on. 1954 to 1968, that is actually when the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. was going on. So that would have been a huge part. S.E. Hinton would have heard about the protests, about the marches and everything. So this would have been a huge part of like shaping her identity. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed, which meant that people could not block you from voting, no matter your race, and that was happening a lot back then. In 1967, Loving versus Virginia. Some of you might have read in 7th grade a poetry book about this, but it was the court case that made it legal for people of different races to marry each other. It's pretty crazy that that wasn't legal until 1967. And then in 1965, that's when Martin Luther King was doing his big marches in Selma, and we'll actually talk a little bit more about them in the next slides. Women's rights were also a huge part of this time period. So S.E. Hinton probably was hearing a lot about women's rights. In 1963 is when the Equal Pay Act was signed, and that meant that women should be paid the same as a man who has her same job. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed, and this was a huge law saying that no employers, so people hiring for a job, could discriminate against you based on your race, religion, national origin, so where you were born, or sex, so like male or female. Another huge thing going on was the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975. So that would have been hugely influential to S.E. Hinton. You can see kind of down here the hippie counterculture. That was something that they would have been outsiders in the United States too. I've got a picture of these are some like real life hippies right here. So the hippies were protesting the Vietnam War, and they were all about love and peace. Also going on during this time was the space race. So the United States was trying to get somebody into space before the Soviet Union was. So you can see the first American in space was 1962, when only 3 years before The Outsiders took place. So that would have been huge for S.E. Hinton as well. And then the Cold War was also going on during this time. Ooh, I have to get out of my pen before I can click to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit more into the civil rights movement because this was such a huge part of the 60s. So this was just an organized effort by Black Americans to end racial discrimination and gain equal rights. It started in the late 1940s and ended in the late 1960s, so this would have been completely going on during in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when the book was written. So 1948 is when the first Harry Truman, the president, signed an order to end segregation. So remember, that means that white people have their place to go and black people had their place to go. They were not allowed to be in the same places. So they ended that in the Army in 1948. 1954, you guys have probably heard of the Brown versus Board of Education case. So that also made sure that schools were no longer segregated. So up until that point, Black people and white people had to go to different schools. So this was the groundbreaking court case that was met with a lot of opposition. So with this one, this was about just over 10 years before the Outsiders. So they would have been desegregating schools. Okay. You guys have heard of Rosa Parks, I hope. So that happened, her refusing to give up her seat for a white man happened in 1955. 1957, 9 Black students known as the Little Rock Nine were blocked when they tried to go to school because they were Black kids trying to go into a white school. So that happened in 1957. The Voter Rights Act, the Voter Rights Act was also 57. These are some more important things. I'll let you guys read through some of those on your own. In this next one, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech was only 2 years before The Outsiders takes place. So Martin Luther King definitely would have been a huge part of this time period. The Civil Rights Act was 1964. Bloody Sunday. So this is when I said we would talk about Selma, Alabama later. So in the Selma, this is right here, in the Selma to Montgomery March, 600 protesters, civil rights protesters, so they were protesting for Black rights, marched from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, the state's capital, and local police blocked and brutally attacked them. They had to fight in court, and this was after they had fought for the court. After that, they fought in court for their right to march, and they did win. And Martin Luther King finally led other leaders to march on March 25th, 1965. So that is the same year that the book takes place. Martin Luther King was assassinated 3 years after. So this was after the book takes place in 1968. So as you can see, there was a ton going on in America for the civil rights movement. And this is by the International Public Library, they say that S.E. Hinton did not portray the culture of the 1960s in The Outsiders as well as she could have. Like I said, there's nothing about civil rights. There's nothing about feminism. There's also really nothing about Vietnam, which we'll get into in a second. So it says here it was a nationwide movement, including Oklahoma, where the book takes place. In the book, it doesn't show any signs of civil rights movements. It doesn't depict the protests and marches that were happening in the time in Oklahoma. This person also goes on to say that hippies were a huge part of the 60s, and they would have also been considered outsiders, like the greaser subculture. But there are no hippies in the book. So this person says that S.E. Hinton didn't do a very good job portraying the culture in the 60s. So you guys will have to think about that as we read the book. Okay, so you should be, if you're following along in your packet, you should be to the slide that says practice. You guys are going to write an SREE answering the following question. Why did S.E. Hinton choose not to include anything about the civil rights movement? So go ahead and in your packet, I really like to organize my SREEs like this. I write SRE. So go ahead and write that on your packet, and then write an SREE. So your statement will be SE Hinton chose not to include anything about the civil rights movement because go ahead and tell me why you think. This is totally your opinion. Remember, you do need to use evidence from one of the slides that we read from here. The criticism slide might be a great one for you to use. But go ahead and write that SREE now. Okay. Coming back, let's talk about the Vietnam War now, because the Vietnam War had a huge impact on the United States. So after the Vietnam War, they actually replaced the draft, where you signed up for the draft, and then if you got picked, you had to go serve in the Army. So it's no longer like that. Now we have an all volunteer force, and that'll be important in just a second after we talk about this. The voting age was also lowered to age 18 because of the Vietnam War. I thought that was super interesting because I thought it had always been at age 18. It inspired Congress to attack the presidency through the War Powers Act, which restricts a president's ability to send American forces into combat without explicit congressional approval. So that just means they made this law because they wanted the president to have to get approval from Congress to send the military into war. So if you guys know from your history class, our government is made up of a system of checks and balances. So they put another check on the president's power. It also severely damaged the U.S. economy, and President Johnson didn't want to raise taxes, and it caused a lot of inflation. It also really weakened the U.S. military. The U.S. commitment to internationalism, meaning that the U.S. didn't really want to get involved with other countries anymore. They thought the public, so just normal people, thought that the Pentagon had inflated how many enemies that we had actually beaten in the Vietnam War. And they were doing it because they were trying to hide the fact that the war was not going very well. During the 70s and 80s, the United States was kind of nervous to get involved in other countries. Like I said, they didn't want to do any more internationalism because they were so unsupportive of the Vietnam War. And that has actually carried through into today. It makes people really nervous about getting into wars. The Vietnam War also split the Democratic Party, and 60% of people who had identified themselves as Democrats all of a sudden were switching over. The Democratic Party had won the last 7 out of 9 elections, but this war really made people switch from the Democratic Party and become either independent or join the Republican Party. There were other things that did it, but people did not like that the Democratic Party was so anti-war. It also made people really suspicious of government. So it made resources scarce, and people who might have supported these programs in the past turned against the president because of the war. And this generation, they're part of the baby boomer generation, became more cynical and less trusting of the government and authority because of this war. So today, the war ended in the 80s. The American people are still divided over the Vietnam War. And it says 43% of people surveyed believed it was wrong and fundamentally immoral. So that's a pretty big percentage of people to agree on something. So just a couple things with how this is related. After 21 years of fighting, the North Vietnam took over South Vietnam, their government, and made them communists. Americans were furious at the end because overall the U.S. efforts didn't help at all. So they felt like the Vietnam War was all for nothing. This is really interesting about the statistics. About 1,450,000 people died during the Vietnam War. And about 9.1 million people fought in it. And that does include the people who died. That does include Vietnamese people. 2.7 million soldiers fought for the United States, and around 553,000 U.S. soldiers died during the war. So that is a huge amount of loss of life from both sides, but definitely from the U.S. as well. The Vietnam War was one of the 5 largest wars. So there are 13 major characters in The Outsiders. Multiply that by 1,000, and that's only 1/50th of how many U.S. soldiers died. Okay, so like I said, this war would have been a huge impact on America, and S.E. Hinton would have been a teenager while the Vietnam War was going on. So it definitely would have been a big issue in her mind, and she did choose not to really address it in the book, even though Dally and Derry are old enough to be drafted in the Vietnam War at that time. She did reveal on the DVD commentary of all places that the future of one of the characters, I won't tell you guys who it is until after we've read the book, but one of the characters gets drafted after the end of the novel and did die in Vietnam. So she kind of chose to incorporate it, but not directly in the book. It was just kind of like her story that she made up in her head. So we know that it was something that affected her and that she was thinking about. So it's interesting that she chose not to include it. There's a famous quote from The Outsiders. Cherry says it in, I think it's chapter 3, maybe 4. But the quote is, "Things are rough all over." So it's thought that maybe S.E. Hinton was thinking about civil rights, the Vietnam War, when she wrote that line. She wasn't just thinking about The Outsiders. But you'll have to tell me what you think about that. Okay, we are going to write 2 more SREEs. So yeah, once again, I really like to just outline it in this SREE format. So you're going to write an SREE answering the following question, and you're going to write, did the Vietnam War affect The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton? So your statement would be, the Vietnam did or did not affect The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton because, and then give me an example from one of the articles from your packet, and then give me an elaboration. All right, we are going to write one more SREE. Go ahead and you can do the same thing where you write the SR, the E. And I want you guys to think of your opinion. Which issue should S.E. Hinton have focused on more in The Outsiders? So on this one, you kind of have to do a different statement. So you'll do S.E. Hinton should have focused on blank in The Outsiders because, and then give me your elaboration with examples from one of the texts that we read, and finish it with an elaboration. Okay, when you're finished, go ahead and silent read.